We are very happy to have Dr. Lisa Bateman back with us here at the Parent Resource Center. She is a clinical psychologist who specializes in providing cognitive behavioral therapy for obsessive compulsive disorder, social anxiety, phobias, panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, stress, depression, body dysmorphia, and eating disorders. Dr. Bateman received her PhD in school psychology from the University of South Florida in 2014. She completed a pre-doctoral internship in which she provided academic, behavioral, and mental health interventions in a clinical setting, as well as in elementary, middle, and high schools. After completing her PhD, she completed a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at the Rothman Center for Neuropsychiatry at the Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital in St. Petersburg, Florida, in which she acquired specialized training in the treatment of OCD and other anxiety disorders in children, adolescents, and adults using CBT with exposure and response prevention. We are very, very pleased to welcome back Dr. Bateman this morning. So, Dr. Bateman.
All right. Thank you all so much for coming today. And it's always a pleasure to be back with the Parent Resource Center. I know we've got a lot of attendees joining us today, and this is kind of an interesting time for us here in Virginia. I know we have some people who are joining us from all over the country, and that's kind of the neat thing about this webinar is that it is open to the public. And so just to kind of give some context of where we are here in Fairfax County right now, we have been virtual, all year up to this point and are just starting this transition back to school. Here in this past week, we had the kindergartners pre-K start going back to school with the hybrid model, and then we're doing waves as students are returning to school with elementary school starting next week. So we really are, right in this transition time. And I know that might look different in other areas of the country, but it's definitely a big change that we're undergoing right now and a big change for our families and students. And so we'll really be touching on that a lot today, just to give a little perspective of what we're going to cover, talking a little bit about coping with the pandemic. But since we've all been doing that for a while now, I'll try to focus the majority of our attention on this transition period that we're in, coping with virtual and hybrid school, and then just kind of surviving. So since it is a Friday morning, we've got a little levity. You've probably all seen this meme by now, but it is kind of a funny take on one of our favorite children's books, Goodnight Sense of Impending Doom, which we've all been coping with for a long time at this point. So you're all probably well aware of stressors for kids during the pandemic. Many of them look much like the same stressors that adults are facing during the pandemic. Changes, very sudden changes in life structure and routine, uncertainty about where things are going, changes in socialization and school and technology, and adapting to this new world of virtual school that none of us really saw coming. And then of course just the increased stress that goes along with the pandemic itself, and fears about illness, and then other stressors with some of those changes that we're experiencing. So just to touch on some kind of general stress coping skills, places to start, those basic physical needs. Some of you may be aware of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this pyramid, and at the bottom are these physical needs, kind of the foundation. If we're not taking care of our physical needs, then, nothing else falls into place. And so, thinking about the physical needs, these things often seem like they're second nature, but what we might find during the pandemic is that it's hard to maintain a consistent schedule for sleep, healthy diet, and exercise. So some of the things that we might have felt like, were very natural prior to the pandemic might have slipped a little bit during the pandemic. We have so since this transition has occurred, it might be harder to get your kids to go to bed early because, you don't have to get up as early to get ready for school the next day. The morning routine may have been disrupted. And so some of these things, one of the things I'm hearing from the people that I work with is that some of these things have kind of gone out the window. And those are things that we can start with, in terms of helping kids feel better, is really making sure we're prioritizing taking the time to, sit and eat as a family, maintaining a consistent sleep schedule as much as possible, having a consistent bedtime and wake time, even if you don't have to get up and go to school the next morning. And this is going to be even more important with this transition. One of the other challenges is, making sure that we do get some daily outside time. So this is something maybe we didn't used to have to think about before. Kids would walk to the bus stop, they would engage in PE, and recess at school and get outside time, get exercise. This is so much harder to do with virtual school. And you might find that it's harder to convince your kids to get outside and leave their screens when there isn't so much of a reason to do so. So how you can motivate your kids, what you might find is that you need to use a little bit more external reinforcement, setting up kind of a schedule, working it into your routine really as an expectation, just like there isn't a choice of whether or not you go to recess or PE, kind of setting up there, we're going to go for a family walk at this time of the day. The expectation is that we go, and then maybe pairing it with an enjoyable activity. So if you are getting a lot of resistance, it might be something where, we're going to go walk in the neighborhood together for 20 minutes. And then when we come back, you can have some screen time, but really kind of making that a priority to get outside, get some exercise, and types of things that are now, we probably as adults are finding are so much harder to work into daily life than they were before. And then some other general stress coping skills, relaxation techniques, mindfulness, gratitude exercises. I'll kind of run over these briefly. I have on there, apps, and that's because there are a lot of great resources out there for these types of things. So even if you were to, go onto YouTube and type in progressive muscle relaxation, you could find videos that you could listen to as a family talking you through how to do this. There are also great apps out there too that I really like. One is called Calm, and you might be familiar with that. And then the other is called Headspace. These are great apps for mindfulness. A lot of them, Headspace is a free app, and then you can sign up for a free trial. So you don't even have to, pay anything to use it, but it does teach you mindfulness techniques, and you can do it with your kids. And so this might be something where, you set up, for 15 minutes in the evening, let's all sit down together and, practice some of these skills and just kind of working it into your daily routine. So I have some examples of these relaxation strategies: deep breathing. The five senses is a mindfulness activity where, you practice thinking of what are 5 things you can see, 4 things you can smell, 3 things you can taste, 1 thing, and you can kind of switch up the senses as you go. But the idea is that it's practicing being present in the moment in your surroundings versus, being anxious about what's to come next. And then gratitude journaling. There's some pretty cool research out there to show that if you sit down and write down 3 things that you're grateful for every night on a daily basis, that you, not surprisingly, feel more grateful, but also that over time you actually feel happier as well. And so these are some things that you can just incorporate as a family, very short kind of things that would take 5 to 15 minutes, but if you incorporate them into your daily life, there can be a big payoff. So, additional stress coping skills, prioritizing meaningful social connections. Social connection has changed so much during the pandemic. And when I say meaningful, this can be trickier for kids. We as adults are maybe more familiar with calling up a friend on the phone and chatting for a while. Kids probably haven't ever practiced that skill prior to the pandemic. So, it might be finding ways that they can connect with their friends that are more meaningful than, perhaps playing a game together. That's how a lot of kids connect these days, is signing onto a video game, and they're technically playing with their friend and chatting with their friend while they're playing, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but there's not that deeper social connection that's happening. And so kids might benefit from practicing, how do we set up a FaceTime call with my friend, and really get to kind of go a little bit deeper in those social connections. Setting boundaries, this is something I think that's interesting during the pandemic, is, we all are probably a little less overscheduled than we used to be, but at the same time, it can be tempting to kind of take on additional things because of that. And then one of the other things that I'm seeing, particularly with the middle school and high schoolers that I work with, is that they're feeling really overtaxed by doing the virtual school and then the amount of virtual homework, and really feeling like their whole day essentially is doing homework. And so really setting limits on, how much time we're going to spend doing some of those things, particularly with some of the kids that I work with who are high achievers and a little bit more perfectionistic. There's this temptation to feel like I need to be spending all of my time doing schoolwork. And one of the things that can be helpful as a parent is saying, we're going to set aside homework time, but we're also going to set aside time to relax and time to engage in enjoyable activities, and really aiming for that balance. And that's something that we as parents can model as well. I put multitasking on there because, multitasking is really tempting with virtual school, virtual calls. We've all probably been there where it feels like, well, it's pretty easy to fold my laundry while I'm on this Zoom call and nobody would know that I'm doing it. But at the same time, one of the things we know about multitasking is that nobody is really a multitasker. You're just switching back and forth between two tasks rapidly, and that actually the benefit that you're getting of each task is diminished when you're multitasking. And so this is something that's helpful for kids to understand, and really to kind of normalize it too, because kids are really struggling with this of how do I make myself pay attention to virtual school when I don't have a teacher who's staring at me right in the classroom, and there's this kind of pressure to pay attention. So helping kids understand the benefits of really trying to avoid multitasking and limiting distractions, and then altering your environment to reduce stress. And it's interesting actually that we just had that experience with the notifications popping up, and how distracting that was, because that's something that we probably see on a regular basis if you're doing school or work on your computer and you've got your phone constantly buzzing next to you, that it's much harder to pay attention. And so that can be a helpful thing to really model for your kids and work with them on, is when we're doing schoolwork, we're going to turn off those notifications, ideally put the phone in another room, anything that we can to really kind of make the environment less stressful. And even, I say that with virtual school, but even outside of virtual school too, when you kind of constantly have all of these stimuli coming at you, that can be very stressful. And it can be helpful to kind of have some time when you do just disengage. So one of the big changes and stressors of the pandemic is, changes in daily life. I think, to some extent, we all struggle with change. And then, as we know, kids in particular really struggle with transitions. So things that we can help, particularly right now, and I know we've got some people who are opting to stay virtual for the rest of the year. And then we've got some people who are just starting this hybrid model where they'll be in school 2 days a week, virtual 2 days a week, asynchronous 1 day a week. And so with that, there's just a lot of change that's coming. So things that can be really helpful, especially for those doing that hybrid model where you're going to be constantly switching back and forth, having some sort of, daily and weekly schedule. So just like, for elementary school students who come into their classroom, oftentimes their teacher writes the schedule for the day on the board. This is a helpful advanced organizer for them to know what to expect. We can do this in the home too. The other thing I mentioned, there could be some temptation if it takes, let's say, 30 minutes to get ready to go to school in person and 5 minutes to roll out of bed and be in school virtually. There can be some temptation to kind of alter, going to bed a little bit later on the nights before you have virtual school and waking up a little bit later. But what we know from a sleep perspective and a stress perspective is that really the best thing to do is to maintain consistency. So you really want to keep those consistent sleep and wake times even on virtual versus in-person days. I wrote this kind of as a joke, changing from your night pajamas to your day pajamas. It's probably a battle to get your kid to get dressed for virtual school, and that's okay. I'm not expecting that they have to get all dressed up just like they would be going to school to sit in front of their computer. But there is some benefit in having that transition from night to day. So even if you're still wearing comfy clothes all day, that's fine. But there is a benefit to kind of getting up, changing your clothes. It's a signal to your brain that this transition is occurring and to kind of be prepared for the day. And so having kind of that delineation between night and day can be helpful. And we already talked about, scheduling the regular exercise. Sometimes you can do this, virtually, maybe during lunchtime, to really get out and walk around. And again, it doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be intensive, especially if your kids are kind of resistant to this idea. If you think about even just on a day-to-day basis when kids are in school and they're switching classes and they're, walking outside of the building to, get to recess or things like that, it's not, these aren't big things, but they're still helpful. And so even if, you're kind of convincing your kid to, walk down the street for 5 to 10 minutes, it's better than nothing. And it can be helpful to kind of just have that mindset of it doesn't have to be anything huge. We can start small. And this next one, it depends on what your situation is and the space that you have available. But we do know that people sleep better and work better if they're not working in their bedroom. So if you have the option to set up a workspace outside of the child's bedroom, that's going to be the best thing, especially for virtual school, that they're not spending all day working in their bedroom, which then signals to their body that, they should be awake in their bedroom, which makes it harder to fall asleep at night. One of the other things I'm seeing, working with kids too, is that the distraction that occurs in their bedroom is, so much more than it might be in other places in the house. So if you can set them up at the dining room table or, something along those lines, that can be helpful. And then the other thing that I think we just really want to embrace right now, this is a hard period, this transition time, especially going from, what we have been doing all year up to this point, and then, really pretty suddenly changing what we're doing. It's hard, and we can validate that for kids. At the same time, I think we want to have this message to them that it's not a bad thing. It's hard, but practicing flexibility is a good thing. It's a good skill to have, and just by changing that mindset, that can be helpful so that we can kind of embrace this change rather than feeling so overwhelmed by it. One of the other challenges with the pandemic that is still ongoing, even with the return to school, is that social interaction looks so different. And even for kids who are returning to school, it might not mean that they're returning to all of their activities and all of their sports and things like that. And particularly for kids who are staying virtual, there might be, added feelings of loneliness of, we've decided to do this as a family, and it feels like the best thing that we're doing. But at the same time, it does feel hard seeing other people being able to be in person with their peers. So you can validate those feelings that this is hard, and that it is normal to feel lonely and sad and to miss friends and family. Some coping strategies, and a lot of people have done this, if it's safe for their family to do so, is form kind of like a pandemic bubble with another family. So you might not be able to see the breadth of people that you used to see, but you do at least have a family that you're comfortable spending time with. This can be really helpful in terms of those meaningful social connections. And so that's always, a potential option if it's safe for your family to do so. Trying to set up ways to practice safe social interaction. So things like, where you're outside with masks on, and still finding ways to kind of do things together. It doesn't make up for it. And, we can kind of also say this to kids, I understand that it's not the same and that it's hard, but it's still good to encourage them to do these things. I hear a lot from particularly, high schoolers who are feeling a lot of loss, is that, it's just not the same. It's not the same. And, we don't want to argue that, because it's not the same. And it's okay to feel sad that this is a hard time that we're going through. But at the same time, still encouraging them, I know it's not the same, but we really do still want to try to do what we can to maintain some of this social interaction. One of the other interesting things that I've thought a lot about with the pandemic, just because I work with kids with social anxiety, is that there's really a loss of practice of interacting with unfamiliar people right now. So, people might be still engaging virtually in social interactions with friends, with family members. That's all great. But some of the things that we have to do on a regular basis, like ordering in a restaurant, are maybe not happening so much these days. And these are useful skills for kids to practice. And when we think about, if you have any tendency towards social anxiety, and even if you didn't before the pandemic, without practicing those skills, when we go back to doing some of those things again, it might feel particularly hard. And so looking for opportunities to do that, and that might be something like, if you order takeout on Friday nights as a family, having an opportunity for your child to be the one to call and talk to the person and order the meal. Things like that, where you can still find safe ways to practice interacting with less familiar people. It might be, having a kind of brief exchange with a neighbor from a distance that you see, and, that your child is maybe not super familiar talking to. Because one of those skills that we're not really practicing right now, most of us probably, is meeting new people and having small talk with people that we're unfamiliar with. So that can be something that's really useful to practice right now. And then if you have more than one child, you've probably at times felt grateful for that during the pandemic, that your child has a built-in playmate. You've also probably at times felt very frustrated with the amount of arguing and bickering that's occurring. That is normal right now. We're spending so much more time with our families, which is, in many ways an excellent thing. It's also really challenging, when your child is now with their sibling, particularly, as you've been doing virtual school all day long. And you might see that there's a lot more conflict. You can normalize this for siblings. Part of why you guys are fighting so much is because they're spending so much time together. This is a normal human thing. The more time you spend with someone, the more comfortable you get, the more you notice the things that frustrate you and tend to kind of have some of these more difficult interactions. One of the most helpful articles I read about managing the sibling dynamic, you can look it up in the New York Times, but they had this kind of depiction of be a sportscaster, not a referee. And I thought that that was a really nice analogy for parents. The idea being that when your children are coming to you, he said this, she said this, and kind of asking you to referee and pick sides, that your goal is to kind of narrate what's happening and help them kind of work through it that way without being the referee of, blowing the whistle on one child and kind of punishing the other child. And so, I mean, there are going to be some cases where that's not 100% relevant, but just in general, that's a helpful way to kind of think about it for parents, I think. And you can access that article if you're interested in reading more about it. I thought it was a really helpful article for parents of how do we manage some of these sibling dynamics during the pandemic. One of the things I hear a lot, especially from high schoolers, is this disappointment of, we're missing prom, we're missing graduation, we're missing our sports season that we trained so hard for. It is very disappointing. And we as parents can definitely validate that. There's this balance between providing perspective. When you want kids to feel better, sometimes there's this temptation to kind of jump right into providing perspective of, yes, you won't remember this 10 years from now, or, it really doesn't matter that much. I didn't have that much fun at my prom anyway, or whatever it might be, that's all well-intentioned of trying to make them feel better about the thing that they're missing, but can feel kind of invalidating. So that idea of, yes, it's really hard to miss these things. It's not fair that you have to miss this thing that you're really looking forward to. You can still provide some perspective. So that might be, it's really hard that you're missing this, but, let's think about all of these other things that we are able to do, as a family, and, kind of balancing that with some of the more positive ways of looking at the things that you are still able to do. One of the things kids really like is having some choice. So for example, if your child generally has a birthday party where they invite many people from their class, and it's a big exciting thing, and they're feeling disappointed of, I'm not able to do that this year. One of the things that you could do is kind of work with them on brainstorming what are some different options that we could do, safely to celebrate your birthday, and then have your child be the one to choose. And it can just be two different options that they're choosing between, but giving your child that sense of control helps in a situation where there really is this loss of control in so much of our lives. And then, one of the things that's challenging right now is that when you don't have sports practice every day after school and all of the things that you are used to doing to keep yourself busy, there is this temptation to gravitate more towards screens. So helping your children find other things to do besides screen time. And this might sound overwhelming as a parent. You're already working from home and trying to balance everything else, and then you're also trying to entertain your child. It doesn't have to be anything, huge and extravagant. You don't have to teach them this, a very difficult new skill. It can be something really kind of that's easy to implement, something that they can do on their own, but kind of getting them involved and picking out what are some things you might be interested in learning to do, what are some things that you might like to do, and then you can kind of get them set up and they can practice some of those things. And then the other thing is you can find fun ways to get them involved in some of the tasks that you're doing at home. So, like my sister-in-law has school-age kids, and she got them involved in baking the birthday cake for their dad. And, in doing so, they practiced cutting their fractions in half and, measuring things to change the recipe. And so, it was a learning activity. It was also something that they needed to do anyway, make the birthday cake. And then the kids found it fun. It was something that they were doing to kind of help out and learn, and they got to eat cake at the end. So again, it doesn't have to be a huge involved thing. Parents have enough on their plates without trying to also, develop extracurricular activities for their kids, but as much as you can encourage them to kind of do some things that don't involve screens throughout the day, that can be really helpful. And then, of course, we're all coping with this uncertainty about the future. I don't think any of us thought we would be here, a year ago. And the challenging thing is we still really don't know what it's going to look like a year from now. The things that we can do for coping with uncertainty are really kind of maintaining structure, focusing on the things that we can control, planning to be flexible, but really it's this mindset of embracing uncertainty. So, I liked this other kind of analogy, trees that bend are more likely to survive a storm. So thinking about that, that we can view embracing uncertainty, being flexible, bending with the changes that we're experiencing, that is a life skill that kind of helps us to be more adaptable and to survive these challenges. And so, it can just be helpful to kind of reframe that of, yes, this is hard, but can we kind of embrace the uncertainty that we're living with and use this as really, a learning opportunity of seeing how well humans can adapt to big changes. You might be hearing more anxiety, even for kids who have never had anxiety before, about COVID itself, illness and death. There's a lot of talk about this in the news. And then, of course, just in general. So things that you can do kind of help kids focus on what they can control, model kind of calm responses to, news and things that are coming. There's constantly new updates now, like about the new variants. And it can feel very overwhelming, even as an adult, to hear some of these things. So really modeling kind of a calm, let's gather more information approach can be really helpful. Opening up opportunities to talk about how kids are feeling about these kinds of things. And, I think one of the temptations sometimes, particularly if your child has some tendency towards anxiety, is to shield them from scary things. The challenge with the internet these days is they're going to hear it. And so better for them to hear it in a safe and, helpful, nurturing environment at home than by, reading it on the news or hearing a friend talk about it. One of the things that you want to do as a parent is provide developmentally appropriate information, but you want to be honest about what's happening, but you don't have to give more information than is necessary. And you really do want to kind of manage your own feelings first before having these conversations with your kids, because understandably, a lot of this is overwhelming even for parents to hear about. One of the big things that I work with, teenagers and adults on who are able to, have access to the internet 24/7 is really setting a limit on how often you're hitting that refresh button. It can be really tempting to constantly, look at the news, and especially early on when there were, news conferences or every single day about this, it can be really tempting to be just inundated with information. You really want to set some limits on how much time you're spending, reading some of these things, and maybe say, we want to be informed. It's not that we're trying not to pay attention to what's going on, but we also don't want it to, take over all of our time and attention. Now, one of the interesting things with anxiety is balancing information with something called reassurance. So I work a lot with kids with anxiety, as you heard. And so one of the tendencies, if you're anxious, is to ask for reassurance to alleviate your anxiety. An example of what this would look like. So if you're just gathering information, it might be something along the lines of having a conversation as a family, deciding that we're going to go back to school, right? So we feel comfortable going back to school because of X, Y, and Z. We're going to be wearing masks, teachers are vaccinated, that initial conversation, we as a family are deciding to go back to school. I would view that as information gathering. Where I would see information or reassurance coming into play is if every morning before school, your child is asking you, is it okay if I go to school today? Or when they come home from school, I'm worried. Is it okay? What if my mask isn't good enough? And so that would be reassurance, because it's something that you've already talked about. So, you already have the information. It's a response to anxiety. The challenge with reassurance is that it's very tempting to provide it. So if your child is saying, I'm worried about this, you don't want your child to feel worried. And so it's very tempting to say, oh, it's okay. And it's okay because of this. The problem with reassurance is that it becomes a little bit addicting. So every time you give it, you feel like you need more of it. And the other thing is that it's really kind of inadvertently validating the anxiety. So anytime we respond to anxiety in the moment, trying to make it go away, we're actually long term making it bigger. And you can explain this to your kids because it feels very hard not to give reassurance when your child is saying that they feel anxious. And so you can kind of explain, there's this kind of, it's sort of like a band aid. So if I tell you that it's okay, especially about something we've already talked about, it's like a band aid, it temporarily kind of covers up how you're feeling, but the problem is still there. And so we really want to focus on, decreasing that reassurance so we can be brave and face the anxiety together. Interestingly, the best response to reassurance is something that most of us probably don't feel comfortable doing. It would be like if your child is saying, I'm worried about this. What if I got COVID? The best response to reassurance would actually be to say, well, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Now, that sounds really callous, and most people are not going to feel comfortable saying that because, it's very hard to not provide any sort of kind of, validation of the fear or helping your child feel better. The reason that that's the best response is that it's really, the thing we want to do with anxiety is give as little attention to it in the moment as possible and really not feed into it, because then, it's something where the more you feed it, the more it grows. But again, most people find that very hard to do. I find it easier as a parent to say something along the lines of, it sounds to me like you're feeling anxious and asking for reassurance. I don't want to answer that question because I don't want to feed your anxiety. Let's figure out something that we can do together to kind of tolerate the anxiety. And that might be something where, you acknowledge that your child's feeling anxious, you label it for them, which is helpful for them to start thinking of, that's my anxiety talking. And then you give them a concrete action to do. So I see that you're feeling anxious. Why don't we go, take a walk or read a book together for a little bit and see how you're feeling in 15 minutes. I find that that's a much easier approach for parents to take. It feels a little bit less like the tough love of, well, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. And it feels easier to say, I understand that you're feeling anxious, and then provide that psychoeducation of, I don't want to feed your anxiety, which is why I'm not going to answer that question again. Um, so kind of moving into, I know we've still got a lot of people doing distance learning 100% of the time, and then distance learning is, as far as we know, going to be in our future for the foreseeable future, at least part-time. So talking a little bit about the challenges of virtual school, setting up a workspace and really trying to minimize those distractions. One of the things that I'm hearing a lot from kids is that they are distracted. This is not surprising, right? I'm having young kids telling me that they're playing games while they're supposed to be doing math. I'm having teenagers tell me that they're texting their friends when they're supposed to be in science. Again, this is not surprising. One of the things as parents that can be helpful is to not veer too much into punishment for those types of things. The reason for that is that, it is happening, even for the most, and I work with, kids who are anxious, who tend to be extremely diligent, high achieving students. Even with those students, it's happening. And I think it's really helpful to normalize that of, it is normal to get distracted and to feel like when you don't have that external pressure to pay attention, it is so much harder to pay attention. The reason that I find that that's helpful, again, is because it is happening, and I'd rather kids be honest with their parents about it and figure out a way to work through it together than to keep doing it and pretend that they're not. So it can be helpful to have that conversation with your kids of, this is a really hard thing to do, to motivate yourself to pay attention. If you as an adult have ever attended like a all day continuing education class, I did that recently, and to sit in front of a computer screen for 6 hours and pay attention is not an easy thing to do. And I think it can be helpful for kids to hear that, because then they're more likely to reach out for help as they navigate this versus pretending that they're doing okay when really it is very challenging. You want to take breaks when you can. One of the nice things about being in school in person is that there are these transitions of, now we go to our specials, now we walk to lunch, now we go to recess, things that naturally break up the day. The human mind is not really designed to sit and pay attention to something for long periods of time. That's why kids do well with, we pay attention for a little bit, then we go do something else. We pay attention for a little bit, then we go do something else. We can model this at home too, especially with homework. homework. So rather than saying, homework time is, especially for high schoolers who have a lot of homework, homework time is going to be from 4 to 7. Most people are not going to be successful sitting and doing homework straight for 3 hours. They're going to be more successful taking breaks. And then the other thing that can be really challenging, and I'm hearing this a lot from the kids that I work with too, is how do we ask for help? One of the things that kids might not be that comfortable with is sending an email to their teacher. That might not be something they ever did before the pandemic. And that can feel a lot harder potentially than just walking up to their desk and asking a question. So one of the things that we can do is kind of a scaffolding approach. Sometimes as parents, it's tempting to say, okay, well, I'll email the teacher for you. But that doesn't help your child kind of practice the skills. And so if it's something like, why don't we sit down and write the email together? And then maybe the second time around, why don't you write the email and then I'll proofread it for you? And then maybe the third time, okay, I think you can do it by yourself. Why don't you give it a try? And so that idea of it's a skill that we're practicing together. Now, executive functioning skills, we all need them, virtual school or in-person school. There's no difference. I listed some of the executive functioning skills here that you're probably familiar with. The reason that I talk about them now is that virtual school requires them so much more than in-person school. So, you think about the planning of how am I going to spend my day on an asynchronous day. So you're given, a stack of work to do and you have all day to do it. The planning that goes into figuring out how am I going to do that is so much harder than a day that's structured out for you where the teacher is saying, now we do this and now we do that. So there's this extra use of executive functioning skills. And I think one of the challenging things for parents too is that you're seeing your child try to use these skills more than ever, right? So when they were at school all day, a lot of times, you didn't see them struggling maybe with some of the time management, but now it's happening at home. You're seeing it all day. You're participating in it. So it's even more important to kind of help with these skills. And I think to normalize how hard it is. So, a lot of the, again, really good students who are struggling with how do I manage my time right now in a way that they've never done before. One of the things that I'm seeing is that kids are feeling really discouraged of, I was always such a good student. Why isn't this easy for me? And that's where you can say, these are skills that college students use. These are things that you may never have had to practice in this way before. That's why it's so challenging. And then helping them do it, kind of helping them figure out how can I break down a big assignment and work on it a little bit over time? How can I structure an asynchronous day? If I have 6 assignments that I have to accomplish in 7 hours, how can I make that work for myself? A lot of times getting started is the hardest part, and I see this a lot with anxiety. So we tend to think about procrastination as laziness. So I'm putting things off because I just have better things to do. Sometimes that's the case. A lot of times procrastination is actually avoidance. So when somebody starts to feel overwhelmed by a massive task or the amount of things they have to do, the natural temptation is to reduce the anxiety by putting off getting started. And this is where you can help your children kind of figure out how can we break it down into more manageable segments? How can we structure it to make it reinforcing? So, starting with, can we work for 20 minutes and then do something fun together, especially for those big projects that kids are trying to manage that, take several weeks to complete that can be really overwhelming. And then probably the most challenging thing for parents is trying to take the emotion out of it. So it can be very frustrating when you're managing executive functioning skills for your kids on top of everything else that you're managing during the pandemic. And it can feel like you and your kids are fighting each other. That's where I think it's helpful to have this kind of skill of externalizing the problem. So the externalizing would be, talking about it in the third person and recognizing we're on the same team. So, me as a parent and my child, we're on the same team together trying to figure out this virtual school stuff. And it can be helpful to talk about it that way because a lot of times it feels like it's this power struggle between parents and children. We're fighting each other when really, you're working together to tackle something that's challenging. And so even rephrasing that can be really helpful in the moment of kind of aligning you and your kids. This is, sort of a joke meme. Fairfax County teachers are excellent. They are doing their job as well as they possibly can with all of the challenges. But at the same time, as parents, you certainly know that having your child at home, there is an element of you're much more involved in the education than you probably ever were before. Even if, the teacher is doing just an excellent job, there's a lot that falls on you in terms of, time management and those executive functioning skills and filling in the gaps, where you're helping your child if they're struggling in certain classes. It's not easy to be a parent and a teacher. There's a reason why, if you are a teacher, that your school would never put your child in your class. That is something that is just, it's very hard to play those two roles. And I think that can be helpful just as a parent to remember, of if I'm feeling like I'm just, battling my child more than ever. For one, that's normal with everything that's going on right now. I'm not alone in that. I'm not doing anything wrong. It's the function of me trying to be my child's teacher while also being their parent, playing both of those roles at the same time. One of the helpful things you can do is kind of model frustration coping skills. So if you and your child are working on an assignment together and the frustration is mounting, you can model that, labeling what's going on of, I think we're both getting really frustrated because this is overwhelming. It's not going to be helpful if we keep, going down this path. So why don't we take 15 minutes and, I'm going to go do this. You can go do this. Let's take some time and then we'll come back together. So, even for yourself, kind of modeling your own frustration coping skills is going to be helpful for your child to watch and see how you're doing that. If you have two parents in the household, or if you have somebody who's kind of moderating some of the virtual school, if you're in kind of a pod or something like that, you can try to divide and conquer subjects so that less falls on one person and it doesn't feel like one person is just always being the bad guy. Just from a parenting perspective, it can be helpful to remember that a lot of times that defiance and not wanting to get started, not wanting to do the work, is rooted more in anxiety than anything else. Sometimes saying that to yourself as a parent of, my child is feeling anxious right now, and it's the anxiety talking when they're yelling at me about getting started. Rephrasing that in your mind can help you stay calm as a parent, because it kind of separates the situation from your child. You might also set realistic expectations. This is something that, I'm seeing a lot, especially with the kiddos that I work with who, tend more towards that perfectionism, wanting to do, every assignment perfectly to the best of their ability. Sometimes is just not possible, especially if you're a high school student, you're taking AP courses, the course load is just too much to manage. And that's where, setting realistic expectations of maybe some of these assignments that are graded more on completion than accuracy, maybe we're just going to set a timer for 30 minutes, get it done and turn it in. And it's not going to be perfect, and that's okay. That can be helpful. I think one of the things to remember is, we are living through this extremely stressful event that's going on right now. And it's always there in the back of your mind. And so expecting kids to perform to the best of their ability 100% of the time while coping with everything else that's going on may just be unrealistic. And so setting realistic expectations can be helpful both for kids and for parents. And then one of the big ones I think that's kind of most important is sometimes school can feel all encompassing, especially when it's happening at home. And, it can be really helpful to set aside time every day that's kind of no school time. We don't talk about school. We don't think about school. We don't check in on what we've completed with school. Having that balance and having that time to just be a family is really helpful, especially now when parents are so much more involved in school than ever. So really kind of being able to set aside that time of, we do need a break. We need some time to kind of not be talking about some of these things. So we're sort of on the road to going back to normal in sort of a weird way, because nothing really is that normal, other than that, we are starting to return to school, but so much of life does not seem that normal. So, how do we cope with this kind of weird in-between period that we're in? One of the things that we know from research is that kids respond best to models who are not perfect, but are coping models. So you think like, the best role model for a kid, let's say a kid who's anxious, is not somebody who's never anxious, right? Because that person's totally unrelatable. So somebody who's anxious reading about a superhero who's never worried about a thing in their life, they're just not going to find anything to connect to there. Now, if they're reading about a superhero who feels scared but takes steps to overcome what they're undergoing with bravery, that's something that is relatable. And so that's a helpful thing to think of as parents. Sometimes, especially in a stressful life event, there's this temptation to put on a happy face and pretend that all is well because you think that that's the best thing that you can do for your child. But what research shows us is that if you actually model a coping response of, this is hard, but I'm figuring out ways to face it, and I'm taking on the challenges little by little, that's actually more relatable to kids. So you don't have to be super parent, you don't have to pretend like it's easy and you've got it all together. You can really model for your kids of, I'm really struggling with, not being able to see grandma. This is really hard. Why don't we figure out a way that we can, send her something that she would really enjoy and we can FaceTime her when she opens it. So kind of that idea of really validating that it's okay to be struggling, and then to also find solutions together. One of the other things you might expect, especially as we're starting to go back to school, so, in this particular transition period we're in right now, for those opting for the hybrid model, is that you might see more behavioral outbursts than ever during the transition. One, that's because transitions are hard. Two, it's going to be pretty overwhelming. So you think about your kids that now for almost a year have been home every single day, probably not going many places, probably not seeing many people. These are going to be challenging transitions. And you might expect that your kid is going to come home from school these first days back exhausted, overwhelmed, frustrated, angry. And so you might kind of frame that as an expectation, one, in your mind, and then two, for them too, to recognize this is a transition time and it's okay to feel a wide range of emotions. Even for kids who are really excited to go back to school, this can still be overwhelming. So you might not expect it with your kids who have been asking, when are we going to go back to school? When are we going to go back to school? And, they're happy about it. It can still be really overwhelming. You can help them practice kind of talking about this. So externalizing their emotions, again, labeling it. I'm feeling really overwhelmed because, I was around people all day and, I haven't done that in a long time. And so you can kind of practice talking about those things. And then really temptation sometimes when you have some behavioral outbursts is to kind of cave to, and, we're all doing this because we're in survival mode, right? It's kind of like, okay, I would rather just spend some time on a screen than deal with the behavioral outburst, in this moment. But of course, long term, that's kind of feeding into some of the challenges. So you want to really kind of maintain your loving but consistent discipline, even during this period when it's harder. Sometimes as parents, it feels like, well, I know this is a harder period for my kid. I really want to kind of give in a little bit more to acknowledge that it's harder. Actually, what they're going to benefit the most from is structure and consistency from you. Another thing is to practice some of these transitions. I put that meme in there about yelling backpacks because, it has been a long time at this point since any of us have probably had to get up in the morning, get dressed, pack backpacks, pack a lunch, get out the door. These are things that are, maybe at one point were second nature. Now they're going to be particularly challenging because we haven't practiced them. And if they were ever challenging, if mornings were not your time before, you might prepare for the fact that they're going to be extra challenging now. You want to kind of practice them ahead of time. So if you know that your child is in the group that's going to be going back to school in 2 weeks, you might start readjusting that sleep schedule, getting up in the morning, practicing packing a lunch, even if they're just going to be sitting at the kitchen table eating it, to get back into that routine, and kind of preparing them for this change that's coming. Another one of the things that I'm hearing a lot about, especially with this transition back to school, is that, how do we cope with feelings of unfairness, especially now that we're seeing more people, potentially, if you're in school, and we're hearing about what these kids are doing. So, Bobby said that they're going to Disney World for spring break. Why are they allowed to do that and we're not? So kind of preparing for some of those conversations of, what are we, and it would probably be helpful before you go back to school to really kind of sit down as a family and decide what are we comfortable with, and why. And you might kind of provide some kind of background for what you've decided you as a family feel comfortable with. Really setting that expectation so that there's not a lot of question in mind, and then practicing how we're going to respond. If you've got someone who's asking you to do something you're not comfortable with. This is a hard skill, I would say, even for adults. If you've been in a situation during the pandemic where you've had friends who have wanted you to attend a wedding or something like that that you're not comfortable with, and you're having to say to somebody that you really care about, like, I really want to do that, but I just don't feel comfortable with it. That's a really hard skill. And so that's something that you can practice with your kids ahead of time, because it is going to come up, especially more and more, and especially with this returning to school. Kids are going to hear more variety of what people are doing, and depending on what you as a family are doing, it's going to look, there are going to be situations where it looks different. And so you want to practice with your kids ahead of time. How are we going to navigate some of these more difficult situations? You can also validate, feelings of unfairness too, because it is hard to see, let's say your family is being extra cautious because you have someone in the family who's at higher risk. It is hard to see other people being able to do more things than you're able to do, and you can really validate that that is a challenge. So one of the things about anxiety, the things that go hand in hand are anxiety and exposure. So the treatment that I do for anxiety is something called exposure therapy. The idea of it is gradually facing your fears. And the reason that we do this is that we know that talking about fears, even on a cognitive level, really doesn't get you that far. At some point, the only way the fear is going to go away is if you practice it. The reason I bring this up is that we haven't had a lot of practice for a lot of potential fears. And this is particularly relevant if you have a child who maybe has a tendency towards anxiety beforehand, but you might see it even in kids who never exhibited signs of anxiety before. The things that I'm expecting to increase after the pandemic, certainly social anxiety because of the lack of exposure and practice, separation anxiety, especially maybe for some of our younger kids, who at this point, especially if you work from home, have maybe seen you all day, every day for almost an entire year. So thinking about that ahead of time of, my child might struggle with this transition back because of lack of exposure. You can provide some education on that to your child. That can be helpful for kids to understand this is a skill, just like playing the piano, where the more I practice it, the easier it'll get. And the reason, if I didn't play the piano for a year and I sat down at the piano, I'm going to feel kind of rusty. The reason that I might feel rusty jumping into a social conversation or waving bye to mom as she drives away in the carpool line, the reason those things feel rusty is because I haven't practiced them. That's an empowering way to think about it, because it gives you a sense of control and a sense of kind of positive thinking of this can get better. So that's one thing that you can kind of be talking about, especially if you expect that your child might feel anxious with some of these things, and then look for opportunities to practice now. And that can be challenging, depending on what your family is doing and what you're comfortable with during the pandemic. But like I said, with social anxiety, it might be something like being able to walk over to a neighbor's house, wear a mask, stay at a distance, and, hand them some cookies that your family made and make small talk with the neighbor. You can do that safely while also practicing, talking to somebody you don't talk to every day. For separation anxiety, it might be something like where mom and dad take turns running out, going to the grocery store, and leaving the child at home for longer and longer periods of time. You're not doing anything that's going to put you at risk in terms of the pandemic, or you're going for a walk in the neighborhood. If you're not even going to stores right now, it's kind of like you're practicing leaving the house, and if your child is old enough, staying home by themselves, or if you're practicing one parent, if your child is younger, one parent leaving the house and another parent staying home and supervising. But finding ways to kind of play around with some of these separations and social experiences that, again, your kids may not have had practice with, and then expecting that as we start to do them again, it's probably going to be harder, and you probably want to ease into it. So if you've got a child who has some separation anxiety and they're starting to go back to school, you might talk with your school about it. You might see, okay, it might be helpful if we practice visiting the school. It might even be helpful if the first day, there's a way for me to kind of sit in the parking lot for a little bit, while my child is in school. And thinking about, are there any ways that I can break it down to make it feel easier? And then beyond school, as things change even more and we get to a point where, you might be having babysitters again and things like that, thinking about, are there small ways that we can practice this? Because we might not be able to jump into where we left off, last March. Maybe my child was super comfortable, if we went out for the night and a babysitter put them to bed. We might not be there anymore. And so we might have to start smaller like we did, when we first started doing this, and work our way up to some of those things. And then the biggest thing when it comes to anxiety is that, as I said before, you want to model that coping response. You really want to help kids understand that the way to overcome fears is, step by step, pushing back against them and being brave. They can practice talking back to their anxiety. Sometimes with little kids, I have them give their anxiety a name or a character, a character from a movie who they don't like, that is their anxiety. Sometimes with adults, I tell them to think about their anxiety as that really annoying coworker that you have to coexist with. There's nothing you can do about it. They're just there. But you do have to, coexist with them. You can't get rid of them, but you can figure out, how can I kind of tolerate that they're there? And that's a helpful kind of way of thinking about it with kids and anxiety is, these thoughts might be there and I might not be able to get rid of them right away, but how can I take steps towards being brave and kind of tolerate that the thoughts are there, not pay a whole lot of attention to them, know that they're there, not try to push them away, because the more you try to push anxiety away, the more it's going to creep back in. And then again, I think minimizing the reassurance long term is going to be really helpful. And then trying to keep the anticipatory period short and structured. So, probably most of us are familiar with this if we've ever had taking your child to a doctor's appointment and knowing that, the best thing you can do when you're sitting in the waiting room is be distracted and not be thinking about how many, shots you're going to get or something along those lines. That oftentimes the anticipatory period is worse than the thing itself. And so one of the things I tell that to people a lot, because it helps them kind of tell themselves, this is the hardest that it's ever going to get. So like the night before the first day back to school, you might be kind of normalizing that, like, this is the hardest part. So once you get there, it's actually probably going to be easier, but this anticipatory period is the hardest. And you really want to maintain some structure. So, the night before you're going back to school for the first time, you still want to keep all of those things, mealtime, bedtime, consistent, but then you also probably want to think about, like, what are some things we can do to kind of be taking our mind off of it and not focusing too much on all the things that are going to happen tomorrow, so that we can kind of cope with this anticipatory feeling. And then you might want to think about, and the hybrid model is actually by default kind of gradual, which is nice, but you might want to think about kind of gradually returning to daily life. So, and obviously, so much of this is dependent on what's safe anyway, but, thinking about if all of a sudden, we're parents are vaccinated and we're feeling like things are better and we're ready to kind of start doing some more things, maybe add things in one at a time. So, your child might have been used to being very, very busy before the pandemic and going from school to aftercare to extracurriculars and all of that. And they probably, enjoyed that. Many kids do. But what they might have found now is that after they've had all this time at home, maybe it doesn't sound that enjoyable anymore. And it doesn't mean that it's not going to be enjoyable again. It just means that you might have to ease back into it. And I'm hearing this a lot from kids who, are actually, and maybe kind of nice for parents to hear, they're actually kind of enjoying all the family time and they're enjoying the time at home. And, that's great. We can maybe maintain some of that as we go back to daily life, but also thinking about adding things in gradually so it doesn't feel so overwhelming. And then particularly if you've got a kid who's maybe more likely to be anxious, you might want to touch base with teachers, coaches, whoever it might be that's going to be there with your child ahead of time, and let them know, how your child is feeling about returning, and kind of help them understand that you might need to kind of take some steps little by little. So even some of, the kiddos that I work with who maybe had some school refusal prior to the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic has been very challenging for that because you haven't had to go to school all of this time. So we're expecting, going back to school that first time is going to be even harder for a kiddo where going to school already was hard. In those cases, we want to talk to the school and kind of the team at the school and make sure they know what's going on and make sure that there's a plan for the child if they're feeling anxious. So really kind of reaching out to those point people in your child's life and kind of establishing ongoing communication with them. The other thing to think about, I know I talked about that morning routine and kind of practicing getting ready in the morning and all of the things that we haven't practiced in a long time. There are a lot of skills we probably haven't practiced in a long time. And this is maybe particularly relevant for kids who with maybe have some challenges with motor skills and things like that. But just in general, getting dressed, tying shoelaces, even handwriting. So, everything has been virtual up to this point. So there haven't been a lot of opportunities to practice those kinds of things. But presumably when we're back in school, there are going to be more opportunities to write things down by hand again. So things that you might practice ahead of time and incorporating ways to do it, so like you might have your child write a thank you note to practice those handwriting skills that they haven't been doing recently. Or, you tell them the grocery list and they jot it down for you and things like that, where you're kind of incorporating some of those skills that we're not, by nature practicing as often, but that are going to be really important moving forward. And then the other big thing is just to expect everything is probably going to take longer than it did before. So maybe plan for some extra time. If you used to be able to just rush through the morning routine and be out the door in 15 minutes, you might anticipate as you go back to school in these upcoming weeks that it's actually going to take 30 minutes. And so you might kind of go to bed a little bit earlier, get up a little bit earlier, shift that bedtime so that you're able to give yourself more time, and then it's less likely to be stressful. As a parent, I really resonated with this. No matter how overwhelmed we get, we can always get more overwhelmed. That's, sort of a joke, but we all probably felt it at some point that, things were hard before managing just parenthood, and now even harder with everything else that's going on, especially for people who are trying to work from home and all of that. So, one of the things that I'm seeing a lot, and you probably are too, is the people who have learned to make delicious bread or sew masks or learn a second language or become as fit as possible during the pandemic. And, that's awesome, good for them. But the thing that I tell people is that, surviving this massive historical event in and of itself is an accomplishment. So if you as a parent, especially, if you've got friends who aren't parents and you're seeing how different their lives are from yours, if you're getting through the day, that in and of itself is an accomplishment, and that's something to really kind of tell yourself. And then, the thing that we've all probably heard before, not that anybody or many people are hopping on a plane these days, but, when you did used to fly, they would tell you, put on your oxygen mask first. You have to take care of yourself first before you can take care of anybody else. That's true now more than ever. So as a parent, especially many people really are juggling. They're taking care of their children and their child's education and their own work from home. You do still have to take care of your own needs. Modeling that is actually really helpful for your kids too. So if you have this tendency to say like, I'll just push through, it's okay, tell yourself that the best thing I can do for my kid is to take care of myself so that I'm being my best self, and I'm modeling to them that balance is important, and that it is okay to take time to relax. So that's something that I think you really want to just kind of keep in mind. And then just, something to hold on to is that kids really are resilient. So are parents. Everybody has had to be very resilient during the pandemic. It's not been easy, but just to kind of tell yourself, we're getting through it one day at a time. And, kids are amazingly resilient, and that can be just kind of helpful to keep telling yourself that, and that, you will get through it. So this is just, for your reference, if you're kind of noticing that maybe things seem to be more intense than just, the day-to-day challenges and adjustments, these are some symptoms you might keep an eye out for of when do we feel like maybe it would be helpful to ask for more help? So I put symptoms of anxiety and depression. The biggest thing to think about with kids is that they might not express these things the same way that we do. So anxiety for kids tends to be more physical. So they're maybe not telling you, I'm feeling worried about going back to school, but all of a sudden their stomach is hurting every night before they go to bed. And depression for kids tends to look a little bit more like irritability than it does like sadness and weepiness. So just things to kind of keep in mind that they might present themselves a little bit differently. So we're going to set aside some time for questions. I know we'll be reading some of your questions out, and I'll get to as many of them as I can. I've also got my contact information here. If for some reason you have personal questions that you want to ask or things that we don't get to, the easiest way to reach me is email. I've got my email on there, but there are other ways to contact me if you have questions after the presentation.
Okay, Lisa, thank you so much. This was amazing information and we really appreciate it. Just want to let our participants know that the chat box is currently open and we would love to get your questions. Lisa is very excited to answer them for you. So we'll give you a minute to get those into the chat box and we'll get started with questions. And we'll leave this up for a minute, Lisa's contact information. If for some reason you misplace it and need to get a hold of Lisa or want to, just contact the PRC and we'd be happy to get you her information as well. All right, so Ha has a question. How do you get an anxious 10-year-old to do something you as a parent know is good for them, such as join a soccer team or a sport they previously enjoyed, just to get them to do it?
That is a great question. And that is one of the challenges here. I'll turn on my video. So hopefully you can see and hear me okay. So yes, great question. How do we get kids to do that when they're feeling resistant and the idea is scary? So one of the things I would say, starting with providing some psychoeducation of, anxiety and avoidance go hand in hand. I understand that it's hard to face a fear. We can do it together, and kind of helping them understand that by facing a fear, it's going to get less scary. One of the things can be kind of finding any sort of internal motivators. So anything that they're most interested in or would care about that would make them more willing to go. Another thing that can help is kind of utilizing resources. So like the example you gave was a soccer team. So it might be something where if you've got, a friend who's going to sign up for the same soccer team and you can volunteer to drive that friend to practice and you guys can go together and it helps to have a buddy there, something like that can be helpful. So if you can use kind of that connection, the social connection, or, again, like soccer team example, connect with the coach ahead of time. And it might be something where, you have an opportunity to set up a time to go meet the coach if they're open to it prior to practice. So, if your child is feeling nervous, they have a chance to talk to that person one-on-one before they have to show up to a practice with 15 other kids. But anything that you can do to kind of make the environment feel a little bit more comfortable. Sometimes it can be helpful to just focus on, let's just get our foot in the door. So a lot of times it's kind of like we fall into this all or nothing thinking of we've just got to do it. But then what happens a lot of times is that doing it, going to a whole practice for an hour feels too scary. And so then there's just this avoidance and digging in your heels, I'm not going to go, I'm not going to go. And that's where I find it's most helpful if you chunk it and you say, okay, I understand this is really hard. Why don't we go for 5 minutes? And if you want to leave after 5 minutes, we'll leave. And sometimes if you just get your foot in the door and they start having fun, they don't even want to leave. Sometimes they do, and that's okay. And so they say, I did it. I stayed for 5 minutes. Let's leave. And then you say, okay, yeah, you did it. That's awesome. That was really good. You faced your fear. Let's try it again next time. And then why don't we stay for 10 minutes? And you kind of chunk it and you show them that little by little they can take steps to face the fear. A lot of times, kids might be resistant to doing something all in the first time, but if you can find something that they'll agree to, then you can kind of get your foot in the door and build from there. It's a slower approach, but it tends to be more effective long term. And then the last thing is just pairing some sort of incentive. So for all of us, facing a fear is hard. And as adults, we mostly choose whether we want to or not. But, for your kid, you might see like, I know facing this fear is good for them and I really want them to do it. you can acknowledge that it's hard and you can tie something positive to it. I know sometimes there's this tendency to feel like I don't want to bribe my kid to do something. And it's not bribery. It's recognizing that it's hard to do something scary and you're reinforcing them for it. So it might be something like, every time you go to practice for 10 minutes, you can come home and you can have an extra 10 minutes of screen time if that's what's motivating to them. So it's that idea of initially, especially if it's something like soccer practice that you expect they really are going to enjoy eventually once they get comfortable with it. Initially, you might use some internal or some external motivation just to get them there. And then what we would expect is as they get to enjoy it and make friends and do things that internal motivation would build. So because sometimes people are worried, like, I don't want to have to, give my kid extra screen time for the next 5 years to get them to play soccer. It's not likely that that's going to be the case. You can use that internal reinforcement just to start, and then you can gradually fade it out later.
All right, thanks, Lisa. So our next question, how can we support parents and students who have selected to come in person and now have a new teacher and or new peers?
That's a great question. It is so challenging because I know, kids who are going in person are getting a new teacher if they opted to be in person. And sometimes kids who are staying virtual are getting a new teacher because their teacher opted to go in person. And that's hard. We're over halfway through the school year, and to suddenly have a new teacher is really challenging. And so one of the things that you can do, again, kind of normalize that feeling of this is challenging. It's hard to have a transition. If you can find out any information ahead of time, that can be helpful, to kind of make it feel like, okay, let's find out who the teacher is and what we know about them. And maybe you can even connect with, if you know someone in the grade who has had that teacher either this year or previously, maybe it's something where if you can get a little bit more information, that feels helpful. It kind of demystifies it a little bit. And then the other thing I think is, finding ways that you can kind of encourage your child to make some of those connections with the teacher, as they start to get comfortable, and knowing that it might take time. And you can kind of reinforce that too of, generally at the beginning of the school year, especially for elementary school students, the beginning of the school year is a lot of get to know you stuff. And hopefully teachers are preparing for that too. They're thinking, okay, we've got to take some time getting to know these students, even though it is midway through the year. But you can also kind of reinforce that to your child of, you can start kind of practicing those things now, telling yourself like it's going to be a little bit of an adjustment period. And you might think back, for your child, you might think back to the beginning of this school year and kind of talk about like, how long do you think it took you to get comfortable with, Mr. So-and-so? And they might say, well, a couple weeks. And okay, good. Yeah. So, well, our new teacher will probably expect it's going to take a couple weeks to get comfortable too. And then kind of helping them see that, they probably felt some sense of discomfort with their first teacher, but they got more comfortable over time. And so just having that mindset of, that will happen again. It might just take some time.
All right, thank you. So another mom is asking, how can I help my child go in person to take the SATs when they are uncomfortable?
That is a great question. The standardized tests are happening in person now. One of the things you can talk to your child about are the things that they're doing to make it safe. So, I've worked with some people who have just taken the SAT recently, and even some of them who felt nervous ahead of time and then went and said after the fact, like, actually, I did feel pretty safe, which is great. So you can kind of talk about that, the things that they're doing, wearing masks, distancing, all of those things that they're doing to make it more safe. So you can kind of talk through some of those. One of the biggest things I see with the pandemic is, focusing on the things that we can control. So we really can't control who around us, what the numbers are in terms of the percent of positive cases and the variants and all of that kind of stuff. We can't control that. What we can control is, maintaining a safe distance and wearing a mask and all of the things that the CDC recommends. And so I think that's the thing to really kind of emphasize to kids. And, with kids who I see who are a little bit more anxious about COVID, it's kind of separating, what are the recommendations versus what is your anxiety telling you. So like, for example, they've pretty consistently said it's pretty safe to be outside. much more so than inside, right? And so, but some people are still feeling like, oh, I don't even want to go outside my house. That's where you can kind of balance that of, okay, what are the experts saying versus what is anxiety telling us? And so if the expert is saying that it's safe, but there's this other voice in my head telling me that it's not, we can label that as that's the anxiety talking. And then the other thing would be to figure out if there's any information you can find out ahead of time that makes it feel more comfortable. So sometimes even working with your child to call. So, whoever's putting on, if it's at, the local high school or something, is there a point of contact that, you and your child could call together and talk to them about what they've done up to this point as far as kind of safety measures, and kind of encouraging your child to gather that information themselves and things that'll feel, more helpful for them to hear. And then the last thing, I kind of jokingly tell this with some of my clients who are more anxious, taking more precautions than they need to, is if Dr. Fauci didn't say to do it, you probably don't need to do it. And that's a little of an oversimplification, right? Because the information has been emerging since all of this started, right? And there was some wrong information when it started, right? They told us you don't need a mask, and then they told us you do need a mask. But I think the benefit now is that, we're almost a year out. And so we really do have good information at this point, and you can really kind of find a lot more consistency in the information. And so that can be helpful to look at together too. Let's see what the experts are saying. Let's see that there's consistency in terms of what they're saying, of the things that we can control. And then, the last part of it would be, is there any kind of intrinsic, motivation? Obviously, going to take the SAT is probably not fun. So you're probably not going to get a ton of internal motivation of, I really want to do this. But if you can kind of make a connection of why are we doing this? And is it helpful? Right now, maybe it's scary to think of going to take the SAT, but we're, the benefit from like a college application perspective of if we go now and, we get kind of a test run and then we can take it again. And, from that perspective of there are some benefits of doing it now in reducing my anxiety about the test itself, even though, I'm facing my anxiety about some of the COVID stuff.
All right, thank you. So next question, how would you support a 7-year-old who has separation anxiety due to the pandemic? So separating from home back into a school environment.
That's a great question. I see this a lot, depending on how soon you're going back. So, if you're planning to go back, next week with elementary school, or if you have more time, if you have more time, some of the kids that I've been working on is trying to find opportunities to safely separate now prior to going back to school. So it might be something like the soccer practice example of, could we, let's say you've opted to stay virtual for the rest of the year. Could we at least practice joining a soccer team where mom or dad, takes me to practice and drops me off and then goes back home, and, I have to stay at practice by myself for, X amount of time. Could I practice that now so that in little bits it gets more comfortable before next year when I'm going back to school? Now, if you've opted for the hybrid model and you're getting ready next week, I would say the biggest things would be, talking about it ahead of time, finding out what your child is feeling anxious about, and then making a plan. So some of the things I've done with kids in these situations, again, this might not feel like the long-term goal, but the foot in the door approach is sometimes the best thing that you have. And so sometimes with some of my kids who are feeling really anxious about going to school, we actually work with the school and agree that like the first day, maybe they're only going to go back for one class. And then, after they get their foot in the door, then maybe, they're going to go back for 2 classes. And so again, it's a slower strategy, but in my mind, it's a better option if you go little by little and work your way up to going consistently than if you show up at the school thinking you're going to go for the whole day and your child refuses to get out of the car and then they don't go at all. So it might be kind of coming up with a foot in the door plan. It might be coming up with something to help them feel more comfortable. So some kids have really benefited from having the option of knowing if they're feeling anxious, they can raise their hand, they can go down to the office and give their parent a call. So that, having a plan in place of what do I do if I'm feeling anxious, at least short term. Again, I don't anticipate that you would have to necessarily use this plan forever, but just to get them back and get them comfortable. The biggest challenge I see with the hybrid model is from that exposure standpoint. We know exposure is most effective if it's consistent. And that's hard with hybrid, right? Because you're going 2 days a week, then you're home two days days a week. So you're not getting that consistency. So the biggest thing that I tell, families who have a child who's feeling anxious is that it's probably going to take a little bit longer. So if you were going back to school full time and you were going to be there every single day, it might only be a couple weeks before you feel pretty comfortable. What I would expect with the hybrid model is that it'll be slower, and that the first day, so let's say you're a Tuesday, Wednesday person. So Tuesday is probably always going to be harder than Wednesday. Wednesday maybe gets a little bit easier because you can do it on Tuesday, but then you've got a whole, 5 days before you go again. And so it's just kind of anticipating some of those things. Having a plan, working with your child to kind of talk about what the plan could be. And so getting their buy-in, what would help them feel comfortable. And then looking for opportunities to practice. So again, if it's separating from mom and dad or whoever the parent guardian is, that's the scariest part. And that could be worried about, I'm worried that something bad will happen to my parents. I'm worried about something happening to me. It's looking for opportunities to practice that safely. And so if that's a little tricky to do with the pandemic, it might be something like you arrange, let's say your child is, safely able to play outside with their next door neighbor. So you arrange for, let's play outside with next door neighbor. Next door neighbor's parent is going to be the one supervising. I'm going to go out to the store and then I'll be back. And so you practice setting up times, and I know it's harder these days because you can't just call up a babysitter, but finding a way to do it where you are practicing leaving for little bits of time so that your child sees that, he or she can do it, that can be helpful too in kind of preparing for that day when you go back to school.
Okay, thank you. So another parent, my child has been very resistant to completing work for school. It's been a battle. We were told to step back and they would eventually take the responsibility. This has still not worked.
Yeah, so I'm hearing this a lot too. And I think one, again, that normalizing approach is helpful, especially for kids who are beating themselves up over it. If your child was a high achieving student and is suddenly struggling, it can be helpful for them to know that they're not alone in this. The biggest thing I see, especially if your child has gotten behind, is that sometimes there's this mindset of, I'll never catch up. And I have to spend all of my time doing school in order to catch up, which of course nobody wants to do. So then they put it off further. And then of course the mountain builds and builds and builds. One of the things that I find that's helpful is to say, for now, we're going to do one thing a day. And again, it doesn't feel like enough. And that's the hard thing as a parent, because maybe you see that your child is behind by 20 assignments and you're thinking, oh my gosh, if we only do one thing a day and they're adding more stuff, they're never going to get caught up. But the thing that we really want to focus on is if they're doing one thing a day, it's better than no things a day. And if you're telling them, let's do one thing a day, that feels a lot more manageable than let's spend 7 hours doing work today. So you might have to chunk it a little bit. And again, it might feel slower than you want it to be, but that's where you want to have that mindset. And you want to tell your child, especially if your child's feeling really overwhelmed, that getting something done is better than getting nothing done. So really trying to challenge that all or nothing thinking. Maybe start with the things that they're most interested in. So if there's a subject that they tend to like more than others, maybe that's the one thing that they're going to do that day. And then maybe there's a way to kind of pair it with a reinforcer too. So, once you get this one thing done, then, you can go outside and play with your next door neighbor or whatever it might be. So kind of setting up some sort of external motivator. But I think the biggest thing, especially if your child has gotten behind, is to try to take it one step at a time, try to make it seem more manageable. You can either do it, depending on what you think would work better for your child. It could be one assignment a day, or it could be a time limit. So it could be like, we're just going to spend, 20 minutes doing something, and then we'll move on to something else. And again, that feels more manageable. And a lot of times getting started is the hardest part. So once you get started, an object in motion stays in motion. So it's easier to keep going after that, but you just have to get over that initial hurdle of getting started.
All right, Lisa, thank you. So I do have a question from one of our parents requiring interpretation. So they were just asking if you could your response be a little slower so the interpreter could make sure that the parent gets the information. I appreciate it. So the parent is asking, she really wants to help her daughter have a social life again, but the daughter doesn't really want to go out anywhere. She wants to kind of stay in her room, just kind of do writing. what could we do to help her maybe just get out of the room and, do some more things that would get her socializing again?
That's a great question. And that is hard these days to, encourage your child to get out of the house when there's maybe less reason to do so. So you can set goals, and it can be, again, something small of maybe, once a week, we're going to call a friend on the phone, or we're going to invite someone to meet up outside. One thing you can do if they're really resistant to that is to try to make it a family thing. So, maybe your child is not feeling like they can call up a peer from class, but maybe you can invite your neighbors who you sort of know to come over and sit around the fire pit in the backyard and chat for a little bit, and you expect that they come outside for that, at least for 30 minutes or something like that. So it might be that initially you take more of a role in setting up some of this. That's obviously easier with young kids because you might have been scheduling the play dates anyway. With teenagers, it's harder because they've kind of got to be the ones to reach out to their friends. That's where you can make it a goal. And you can tie it to something too of, if their preferred activity is staying in the room and drawing or something like that, it might be something where it's, okay, first we're going to reach out to a friend, and schedule a time to talk and talk for at least 5 minutes on FaceTime, and then we can go draw in the room. And so setting it up, pairing it with something, and then if your child is really resistant, it might be tying it to some sort of external motivator that they care about. So if it's extra screen time or some sort of privilege, it might be that you do need an external motivator. Again, that's a short-term solution. We would expect that once it gets easier, you wouldn't need that anymore. So if you're kind of resistant to, I'm not sure I want to do that, you don't have to do it forever. But then the biggest thing I think is setting manageable goals and then working with your child to figure out, for some kids, particularly I think elementary school kids who their friends tend to change every year based on what class they're in, they may not have talked to friends that they were close to in person since last March, but they may not have had an opportunity to really connect with friends in their class this year virtually. So they might feel like it's way too weird to call up my friend that I haven't talked to since last March, but I don't really feel comfortable talking to anybody in my class. And so you might have to find ways to kind of brainstorm, how do we bridge that gap, either to reconnect with past friends? How do we look for, maybe it's neighbors or other people that we could have more contact with? Or how do we kind of set up that skill of trying to get to know somebody a little bit better virtually so that we feel more comfortable reaching out to them? So that I see as kind of the biggest challenge, more so for younger kids. For older kids, it may just be something where, again, those friends have been there, and maybe they were acquaintances that they had in school, but that they never really kept up with that much outside of school. And now it's figuring out, how do we have that skill of kind of initiating some of those social contacts. Sometimes there's a fear of rejection, and it can be helpful to kind of face that fear together, and to remind kids that sometimes kids feel like, well, so and so didn't reach out to me, so they don't want to hang out with me. And it can be helpful to kind of have that conversation of, making the first move is really hard, and so might not be making the first move for the same reason that you haven't. So kind of having them kind of recognize, okay, somebody sometimes has to be the first one to reach out, and that's a hard thing to do, but it's a skill that we can practice.
All right, Lisa. I'm not seeing any other questions at this point, and we are really at our time. So I want to thank you so much for this great presentation today, and thank our audience for your participation. But please do reach out to Dr. Bateman if you have any other personal questions that you would like to ask her, as well as we've put in the chat box our evaluation, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback today, especially with any topics that you would like the PRC to bring to our families. We would love to hear from you. So, Dr. Bateman, thank you again for joining us today with all this great information. And we look forward to working with you again. And we hope that everyone has a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend. And please don't hesitate to reach out to the Parent Resource Center if you have any other questions or need any other resources. We are here to help everyone. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.